Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Medical Grand Rounds. I'm Dr. Laura Lacher. We'll go ahead and get started with some logistics and then introductions for today's very special Grand Rounds. Next week, we will be hearing Approach to Joint Pain, which will be given by the rheumatologist, Dr. Sonam Kiwalkar. Grand Rounds is now a joint effort between Providence St. Vincent and Providence Portland Medical Center. We are often available to attend live at Providence St. Vincent on Tuesdays and occasionally live at Providence Portland. You can always be with us here on the Teams Live platform, and you can earn CME credit by attending live virtual, or watching a recording of the event, and that recording is the same as the Grand Rounds invite link. You can also always learn from the weekly invite where we will be, whether we will be live or just virtual. And now on to introductions for today. Today is the annual D.E. Olson Lectureship, which was established by Dr. Olson's wife and children as part of his legacy at Providence St. Vincent, where he was leader of the Department of Medicine for 41 years. He was among the early pulmonologists and began his career at the Portland Clinic in 1955. He was Professor Emeritus of Pulmonary Critical Care Medicine at OHSU, as well as founder of the Oregon chapter of the American College of Physicians. Dr. Olson's dedication to medical education at every level was truly exemplary. In the words of his physician colleagues, he had this wonderful humility and sincerity and continuous quest for knowledge that immediately bonded him with his patients. And it is in his honor that I am absolutely delighted to introduce our guest for today, Dr. Anthony Williams, who is an Associate Director of the MedPeds Residency Program at the University of Minnesota, Associate Director at the Center for the Art of Medicine in the University of Minnesota Medical School, and a practicing MedPeds hospitalist who splits his clinical time among multiple teaching hospitals in the Twin Cities, including Regions Hospital and Children's Minnesota. Dr. Williams earned his bachelor's in chemical engineering from the University of Oklahoma, then did a joint program at the University of Minnesota in which he earned his medical degree and a master's in biomedical engineering, and then completed combined internal medicine and pediatrics residency at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Williams lives at the intersection of narrative, mentorship, and advocacy. His passions include creative writing, utilizing the power of artistic expression to elevate marginalized voices, and supporting trainees as they navigate complex, often pernicious, clinical learning environments. His stories have been featured in the Journal of Graduate Medical Education, on the Nocturnist podcast, and in the Twin Cities Public Television Art and Medicine series, which aired nationally and won a Regional Emmy Award in 2022. Dr. Williams, I'm absolutely delighted to have you join us today. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction, and it's an honor to be here. Thumbs up, able to hear me okay?
All right. Absolutely, thumbs up.
Excellent. All right, well, let's get started then. Okay, so I have no disclosures. And today we're going to talk about some of the science behind why stories can be so powerful and why people tend to place trust in them. And we're also going to look at some examples of how we're using stories in the healthcare space within the Twin Cities, but also nationally to advocate and push for positive change. And through the process of hitting some of our primary objectives, I hope to also leave you with a better understanding of what the Center for the Art of Medicine is, or CFAM as we like to call it, and how our work there can intersect with other roles that at first glance seem completely distinct. So first, I want to begin with an overview of how my clinical and non-clinical time is distributed. This is relevant because the multi-site nature of the Twin Cities is something that I take for granted because I did my training here and now I work here, but this setup definitely impacts a lot of what I'm going to cover today. Not so much in the theory behind storytelling, but in the practical applications. So these are the teaching sites from the vantage point of the University MedPeds residency program. Our residents rotate through 7 different sites, which keeps them pretty busy. And yes, I do realize that there are only 6 icons on this map, but the one that is circled in gold should actually be 2 separate icons because the Mississippi River actually splits Masonic Children's Hospital and the adult teaching wards into West Bank and East Bank campuses. And in some ways, having a lot of different teaching sites is good. We have a ton of trainees in the Twin Cities and the resources of several different healthcare systems to draw on. Our residents also tend to feel that they're prepared for anything after practicing in so many different settings. But in other ways, it makes things more complicated. It's a headache to battle Cerner, different versions of Epic, and CPRS. It can also be hard to implement systemic changes when every site does things a little and sometimes a lot differently. And it can also add a layer of isolation and stress to our trainees because they can be spread out pretty thin across the Twin Cities. My clinical time as a MedPeds hospitalist is split between 3 of these clinical sites. There's Regions Hospital, which is in St. Paul and deals primarily with adults, but also has a nursery, a peds burn unit, and does pediatric trauma. And then there are the 2 standalone community children's hospitals, one of which is in Minneapolis and the other is in St. Paul. I also sit on the Mistreatment and Bias Subcommittee for the Categorical Internal Medicine program, which I'll go more into depth on later. But for the moment, what's relevant is that it deals with trainee reports of mistreatment from the VA, the Adult University Hospital, and Regions. And I sit on the mirror entity for Categorical Peds, which deals with Hennepin County, the 2 children's sites, and Masonic. Now, the Pediatric Mistreatment and Bias Committee is still relatively new, so I won't be incorporating any of that data into today's talk. And lastly, there's CFAM, which is housed out of the medical school here at the university. So not only does this provide an overview of my various hats and how they map geographically to the Twin Cities, it provides the framework for a different kind of disclosure. Today's talk will be drawing from multiple perspectives. I'm hoping to weave together the various facets of my split administrative roles to essentially foreground the idea that much of what I choose to do comes from the same passion, which is using the power of stories to make positive change. For me, storytelling is the through line that ties things together. And in that pursuit, I'm fortunate enough to work with several groups of awesome people. This is at CFAM, this is as an APD, and this is also through the Internal Medicine Mistreatment and Bias Subcommittee. And I'm taking the time to call this out explicitly because this presentation and how I think about my various roles wouldn't be possible without their contributions in terms of thoughts, ideas, and labor. So with all that out of the way, let's jump in. So when I think about the importance of stories and advocacy work, I feel it's necessary to ask ourselves questions about what we're choosing to advocate for and what we're struggling against. But before we can get to those questions, we need to understand why are stories the battleground in the first place and what makes them such powerful tools. And to that end, we'll start off with a bird's eye view of some of the theory and science behind storytelling. We'll talk about dual process theory, we'll talk about narrative and emotional transportation, we'll talk about oxytocin and trust, and neural coupling. And after establishing this theoretical foundation, we'll move into some practical applications. So many of the ways that stories function within us are thought to have some foundation and origin in evolutionary psychology. So a ridiculously oversimplified way of thinking about evolutionary psychology is that as a field, it seeks to understand the way that humans think and behave using the knowledge we have about the environment in which we became human. And dual process theory, which many of you have probably heard of, is part of that understanding. This theory says that we have 2 primary ways of thinking. We have type 1 thinking, which is reflexive, spur of the moment thought. It's automatic, it's implicit, and uses primitive parts of the brain. It's the mental shortcut using data that we've collected unconsciously and consciously over our entire lifetimes to make these quick probability judgments and assessments about what's happening. It's the initial thought that a twig snapping late at night during a camping trip may signal danger and that we need to be on alert, which as an aside is one of the many reasons I don't camp. But after living in Minnesota for so long, I'll at least consider glamping under the right circumstances. But anyway, the point is we use these type 1 heuristics to help us survive and evolve. While this type 1 processing is a feature and not a bug, it can come to conclusions that are incorrect and irrational. As such, type 1 processing is often where our biases can be found. Biases themselves are natural and unavoidable because unconsciously we are internalizing information about our world all the time. So when we don't see people of color at the table where decisions are being made, when we see immigrants portrayed as other, when we don't see models who use a wheelchair for mobility, all that tells us something about our world. And our brains use that information to create our reflexive perceptions about reality. Type 2 processing is reflective. It's what we do when the danger is over and we actually have time to think. Type 2 can, to some extent, rein in and overcome the type 1 heuristics, but it's always a fight to combat that type 1 processing. And of course, for some people, their type 1 biases have also been transformed into type 2 processes. So where does story fit in with all this? Well, stories are, by their very nature, reflective. They allow and require us to slow down and think and engage in type 2 processing. As such, stories have been called a, quote, moral technology. And like any technology, they can be used for good or ill, because when enlisted by charismatic leaders and turned into dogmas and social policies, they've also been the foundations for extremely harmful systems. And dominant groups or in-groups throughout history have told themselves a lot of stories. The Crusades, imperialism, Manifest Destiny, slavery, the Holocaust were all born out of stories told by one group in order to define itself and justify horrific actions against another group. And because the dominant group tends to be in positions of power and influence, they are better able to amplify the dominant narrative, which provides a shared reality in which its own superior position is seen as natural and right. But since the early days of interdisciplinary and socio-political movements like critical race theory, radical feminism, and critical disability studies, there has been a call for counter storytelling, i.e. using the stories of members of an outgroup to counter the narratives of the dominant culture and create a kind of counter reality. And what we end up with is this social and political tug of war between dominant groups and outgroups in which story is the rope. And we fight over story in particular because we know that it might be the most powerful tool for influencing others that we have. And there are plenty of examples of this, but let's take a brief look at the anti-vaccination movement. Now, to try to quantify the gap between the power of stories and the power of statistics, the authors of a 2011 study created a fake message board / social media feed that they had subjects read. And mixed within random posts, there were posts with stories about bad vaccine outcomes or statistics about actual vaccine outcomes. Now, this figure on the left is a little bit busy, but the takeaways here are that in experiment 1, as the number of posts with stories of adverse vaccine events increases, the intention to vaccinate decreases. And experiment 2 showed that people were more affected by stories generally. No matter how convincing the data in favor of vaccination was, the risk perception and the intention to vaccinate were more influenced by an increasing number of stories. In other words, the stories overruled the data. Stories are powerful, and it doesn't take a huge cognitive lift to understand why in-groups, both historically and today, fight back when they are decentered from stories. This table from PEN America shows the types of stories that are being banned in libraries and schools around the country. As you can see, books in which LGBTQ+ characters and characters of color are centered are by far the most likely to be banned. So we know that stories can engage type 2 thinking and can often supersede statistics and other forms of data when it comes to influencing our behavior, but why do they have the power that they do? One reason for this is something called narrative transportation, which is the understanding that stories have this ability to take us outside of ourselves and our lives and provide experiences and points of view that we would never be exposed to in our real lives. It's essentially a description of what I'm sure most of us have experienced when we get lost in a fictional world with fictional characters through books, TV shows, and movies. So as an example, even though I've never been north of the wall, every time winter hits in Minnesota, it feels like I'm there, whether I want to be or not. And I'm checking my rearview mirror for White Walkers. And in those moments, I curse narrative transportation. But in general, it's something I'm a fan of. So stories cause us to engage in a type of mind reading, if you will, through which we theorize about the beliefs, desires, and intentions of others that may differ from our own. And this type of engagement is an extremely important pro-social skill. Additionally, studies have shown that we engage in kinesthetic empathy and kinesthetic intelligence anytime we watch someone engage in a task. For instance, when you watch someone swing a hammer, your brain is engaging the same sensory and motor areas as it would if you were the one doing the task. Stories do the same thing. The combination of kinesthetic empathy and intelligence adds up to a unique kind of doubling between self and other. And these things, narrative transportation, theory of mind, and doubling of self, all add up to what we call emotional transportation. And this emotional transportation has been shown to be a powerful means of building empathy. And this empathy pathway is not just an academic concern, it has measurable effects. There was a study in 2013 that looked at the effects of a narrative passage from an emotionally charged section of this book called Saffron Dreams, which is the story of a Muslim woman in New York City in the days after the 9/11 attacks. The subjects of the study, which it is important to note were predominantly white American Christian college students, were given one of three texts to read, either a full 3,000-word narrative passage or a condensed narrative, which was basically a list of facts from the narrative without any of the narrative flourishes, or some unrelated expository text. These subjects then completed a number of validated tests of empathy and association studies. And those who read the full narrative were found to have statistically significant increases in empathy scores, decreased negative attitudes, both implicit and explicit, although the biggest impact was seen in reducing implicit prejudice specifically, and also decreased intergroup anxiety. And intergroup anxiety is the ambiguous feelings of discomfort or anxiety when interacting with members of other groups or groups not like yourself. Additionally, there have been a couple of meta-analyses looking at methods to measurably decrease prejudice, which found that entertainment, of which stories and narrative are a huge part, have relatively large impacts on reducing bias compared to other interventions, which are interventions like anti-bias curriculums, direct contact with outgroups, emotional training, which tries to train individuals to use emotional regulation strategies to offset their own biases, things like that. Now, the authors of these studies and these meta-analyses do acknowledge that there is a general lack of quality data on this topic, but the data that we do have seems to double down on this idea that stories are potent. And if you're anything like me and you say, okay, I understand that stories can do all these cool things, but like how? What's the mechanism? If you ask these questions, you'll eventually arrive at the fascinating rabbit holes of oxytocin and neural coupling. So oxytocin is a hormone classically thought of as being released into the bloodstream with labor and breastfeeding. It helps with birth, milk production, and bonding with the baby. However, recent research also shows that it is a key hormone in developing trust and empathy more generally, and that compelling stories are a means of triggering it. Professor Paul Zach's group has made a career out of studying oxytocin's effects on trust. I'm not going to get super deep into the studies, but basically through a series of experiments, they've been able to show that oxytocin is tightly bound to trust in humans. Through playing various validated entrustment games where you incentivize people to trust or distrust each other, they've shown that oxytocin goes up when people trust each other and down when they don't. Additionally, the same group has done studies that show that emotionally charged stories increase oxytocin in listeners, which increases empathy as well as generosity. Now, pivoting a bit and approaching this from a neurological perspective, there was a group out of Princeton in 2010 that discovered a phenomenon they called neural coupling. They used fMRI to study the relationship between a storyteller and their audience. So they put someone in an fMRI, had them tell a story, and measured which parts of the brain were engaged. Then they had people listen to the story while in the scanner and found that their brains linked up in really interesting ways and in many more regions than you would expect from what we know about neuroanatomy. Basically, there was a lot more action going on than just in Broca's and Wernicke's areas. And these authors looked at not just the areas that were coupled, but also started looking into what caused this coupling and how different stories affected it. They found that there was matching between storyteller and listener and among groups of listeners, not only in terms of arousal, which is matching the emotion felt, but also in terms of valence, which is matching the degree of feeling between storyteller and listener. And that the higher the degree of emotion in a story, the more intense this neural coupling is. They called this process emotional contagion, and it fleshes out that empathy through emotional transportation phenomenon that we talked about earlier. So again, stories are tools, they're a technology, and they can be used to create empathy for either side of a struggle. Because there's also data that stories that confirm previous biases are more convincing than those that counter them. So it's important that we use stories for positive change and that we elevate and share stories that uplift and connect. So that's a bit of the theoretical foundation. Now I want to pivot and talk about how we're trying to use stories to drive change in clinical spaces. And to do this, I'm going to use a very personal lens. I'm going to take you into a moment in time when my identity as a Black hospitalist intersected with the work of CFAM and the work of the Mistreatment and Bias Subcommittee to help create something that, frankly, I never thought I'd have a chance to do. So there were two parallel and distinct ideas that both coalesced independently in 2020. The first was a renewed focus on increasing diversity at the faculty level at the University of Minnesota. This idea had been building momentum for several years going into 2020, but the combination of George Floyd's death and the very clear racial disparities in COVID-19 outcomes catalyzed this process and pushed it over the edge in a good way. So where before there had been conversation and interest only from a relatively small group of individuals, in the latter part of 2020, suddenly everybody was talking about it, and there were funds available and new positions, and these changes filtered through the ranks of GME and down to the residency programs, which I'll come back to in a bit. The second idea was the birth of CFAM and the surprising success of some of our earliest projects. So first, I'll start with the PEC, which stands for the Program Evaluation Committee. And to simplify what this is, for those of you who don't already know, the PEC is basically the quality improvement mechanism of the residency program. It's an ACGME mandate that all residencies and fellowships have a PEC of some kind. Our PECs are a diverse membership of faculty, program leadership, chief residents, and residents who identify target areas for improvement through various mechanisms. Now, I'm a part of both the categorical internal medicine and categorical peds PECs, but for the purposes of this discussion, I'll be talking exclusively about the internal medicine side. Now, prior to 2020, the PEC had already identified a relative lack of diversity in our faculty as an opportunity for improvement. And the important part here is not just a lack of diversity in general, but a lack of diversity relative to the composition of our resident classes. For example, this is a recent class of residents composed of internal medicine, med peds, and med derm residents. And approximately 30% identify as underrepresented in medicine, and yet at the same time, only 6% of University Department of Medicine faculty were underrepresented in medicine. And this class wasn't an outlier. Multiple prior classes were between 20 and 30% URM, and yet that didn't filter up to the faculty level. Not only that, but there were a sizable percentage of URM graduating residents that didn't choose to stay on at any of our teaching sites, and we have a lot of them, but instead elected to leave the state of Minnesota entirely. Like literally they couldn't get out of here fast enough after graduating. And the physicians who first started this work began attacking this problem from the standpoint of stories. So off the record, they started asking graduating URM residents questions like, so why did you choose to come here? And many residents answered similarly. They said that when they were applying to residency, they looked at the headshots of current residents and noticed our classes were super diverse. And that made them comfortable applying here because they knew they'd have a community. So that naturally begged the question of why 3, 4, or 5 years later, they chose to leave after their training. And those answers too had consistent themes. Many URM residents recounted stories of implicit bias, explicit bias, and mistreatment from multiple sources, like patients, nurses, and attendings. Some stories were subtle, some were blatant and terrible, but all of them added up and affected their decisions on where they chose to work or not work after residency. And to be clear, it wasn't like these experiences that they were telling us about were some kind of M. Night Shyamalan twist. What the residents were saying vibed with my personal experience of residency. And also there's this growing body of data nationally that shows that not all trainees are going through the same residency, even if they're in the same residency. And that those differential experiences culminate in certain endpoints like where trainees choose to practice or not practice in the case of academic medicine and rates of trainee burnout. For example, when studies poll residents from multiple specialties and multiple institutions and ask them things like, so what's it like to be an underrepresented minority at your program? You get these themes that are depressingly consistent. You get persistent assumptions of lower status, where people assume residents of color are anything but a doctor. You get consistently being mistaken for other residents of color, even when there are very few residents of color in the program. You get explicit biases and harsher consequences for mistakes, and this one is particularly insidious because it typically comes from attendings who are in a position of power. And these consequences often manifest as keywords that are coded under the guise of milestones and milestone development. So a genuine mistake that many residents might make is described more harshly in some groups than others as clinical knowledge deficits or lack of confidence. There are barriers to reporting discrimination, whether this is the logistics of how to report at local sites, which was one of the things that was going on at Minnesota because we have several, or residents feeling like they're too busy to take the time, or the pervasive feeling that nothing's going to change anyway, so why bother? There were fears of repercussion, either from an individual or from the program. And then there was a pervasive sense of social isolation and a lack of professional mentorship. And many of these things are happening on a daily basis and from multiple sources. And if this is the daily experience for our URM trainees, then it's not all that surprising that compared to their white counterparts, they're more likely to withdraw from residency and more likely to take extended leaves of absence. And for the few who choose to pursue a career in academic medicine after graduating, they can look forward to fewer promotions and higher attrition rates. Also, there were studies from the mid-90s and early 2000s that demonstrated that minority faculty received less NIH funding and less compensation in general compared to their white counterparts. And although these disparities have improved in more recent studies, so they've gotten better, it's not a stretch to consider the idea that academic medicine as a field is still experiencing the ripple effects of these disparities even today. And to put the icing on the cake for us, there was a pilot study from JGME published in 2019 in which researchers from right here at the University of Minnesota assessed the prevalence of mistreatment of residents and fellows. They administered a short institutional questionnaire to 234 graduating residents in the 2017 to 2018 academic year. The largest percentage of respondents came from pediatrics, internal medicine, and general surgery. They found that in general, patients were the primary source of mistreatment for trainees. The only exception was for the category of humiliation and shaming, which were primarily from faculty. However, it should be noted that although patients were the primary source of mistreatment mostly across the board, there were still notable instances of offensive remarks and microaggressions from faculty across all programs. And so, from the resident stories, the national data, the local data, and the political climate at the time, the Internal Medicine Mistreatment and Bias Subcommittee of the PEC was officially launched in October of 2020, which is when I officially joined it. This subcommittee had several goals. We wanted to build an easier reporting system for residents that could cross multiple sites, because before each site had its own reporting system and they didn't really talk to each other. And there were actually some cases where we didn't even know where the reports were going. They just disappeared into the electronic ether. We wanted to create a better learning environment for trainees and ultimately shift the demographics of faculty to better reflect the composition of our trainees and our patients. Now, this subcommittee is composed of residents, chief residents, and faculty from all of our teaching sites who triage individual reports, make formal recommendations to leadership and departments, and we ultimately hope to use this information to bring about long-term institutional changes. And so, pivoting just a bit, and almost in lockstep with the emergence of the Mistreatment and Bias Subcommittee within internal medicine, came the emergence of CFAM within the medical school. And although CFAM didn't officially become a thing until 2020, its roots stretch back much further than that. So this is Dr. John Hallberg. He's a family med doc who has worked at the intersection of the arts and medicine for many, many years. He was the physician for the Minnesota Orchestra, for the Guthrie Theater, which is a nationally famous theater that's right here in Minneapolis, and many other arts organizations throughout the Twin Cities. He also had a weekly spot on Minnesota Public Radio for almost 2 decades. And in 2009, John began producing a series of live theatrical performances known as Hippocrates Cafe. These shows use storytelling and song to explore complex healthcare topics. And over the years, John created dozens and dozens of these shows. And in 2020, he leveraged his connections with public media and with Twin Cities Public Television in particular to create an hour-long TV version of Hippocrates Cafe that combines story with socially distanced song and poetry. I told a story in this show. I'm in the bottom right in the blue shirt, and it was an amazing experience, but it was also only supposed to be a one-off thing. But then the show was picked up and distributed nationally and resulted in a regional Emmy. So that success created momentum not only for more TV shows, but also to pull together other like-minded physicians and drop us into a new center within the medical school. So John tapped Dr. Maren Olson here in the top right, a pediatric hospitalist, and Dr. Ben Trepay, a med-peds hospitalist, to be co-directors of the new Center for the Art of Medicine. And Maren and Ben had also been busy little bees the last several years, slowly integrating storytelling into graduate medical education. So in addition to running reflective writing workshops and creating writing groups for residents and medical students, they also planned and organized live storytelling events. These story slams were inspired by the Moth Radio Hour, had a healthcare focus, and featured residents, fellows, and faculty from all across the Twin Cities as storytellers. So the threads of Hippocrates Cafe and the Storytelling in Medicine program were woven together to create the backbone of CFAM. The Art of Medicine Student Awards were added to this, which are annual grants that current Minnesota medical students can apply for to pursue any artistic or creative endeavor of their choice while they're in medical school. And these three programs became the core of CFAM. We staffed up. I joined as an associate director, primarily from the storytelling and writing standpoint, but also to run the Art of Medicine Student Awards. And our first order of business was to continue building on the momentum created by the surprising success of the pandemic show. And by this point, we were into 2021, and the new internal medicine mistreatment reporting system was up and running. We were collecting data, and a lot of it was in the form of stories. We had many reports of gender bias, where female residents reported experiencing harsher consequences for similar mistakes compared to their male colleagues. We had themes of othering that led to heightened senses of imposter syndrome, and at least one resident stating that, like, every day they feel like they shouldn't even be here. We had large numbers of implicit bias reports like this one, where residents of color were just routinely assumed to not be doctors, even when wearing white coats, stethoscopes, and badges that clearly identify them as physicians. And we got painful firsthand accounts of humiliation, where an attending told a nurse, yeah, if you're not getting what you want from her, and points at the resident, then just tell me because they don't know. And this particular exchange actually happened in front of a patient. And several residents, either in the reports they filed or in verbal debriefs afterwards, talked about the emotional impact of these experiences. They talked about the daily fight to hold it together, the sense of being othered to the extent that it overwhelmed their professional identity, and they talked about burnout straight up. Seeing these stories made it pretty clear to us, the subcommittee, why URM residents were choosing to leave after graduating. But it was also clear to me that these were voices that needed to be heard. So after everything that had gone down in 2020, after January 6th, 2021, and after reading these depressing stories about what our residents were going through, when we were told to bring our ideas for the next show to the CFAM planning meeting, I felt some kind of way about it. I rolled in cool on the surface, but secretly ready for battle underneath. I wanted to do a dedicated show about the URM experience in medicine. And then I experienced the downside of working with really awesome people, because as soon as the meeting started, somebody else suggested the same idea, like right out the gates, and everyone just agreed in like 5 seconds, and then we moved on. And then I was just emotionally dysregulated with no outlet because I was prepared to argue my point, which made for an awkward meeting for me, but whatever, I'm over it. So we just spent the majority of that meeting scheming about how we were going to sell this idea to the TV people. So we talk it out, we craft an email, and we send it to the producer of that first pandemic show, whose name is Brittany, who's super awesome, by the way. And she responds pretty much immediately like, yeah, that's what we were thinking too. Let's meet next week and get this started. Good talk, guys. I was like, okay. And just like that, the process started. We knew some medical students who'd be great for the show. We knew early and late career faculty who'd be great for the show, but we also really wanted residents. And there was this initial question of, oh, is it going to be challenging to find residents who fit the theme of this show and get them to do this? Now, if I was more clever, I would have had a meme ready to go for this exact question, but I wasn't. So I just chimed in and lamely volunteered to reach out to a few residents who I thought might be interested. And when it came to reaching out to trainees, I wanted to be really, really careful for several reasons. The first reason is that I'm an APD, and I wanted to be cognizant of that hierarchy. I didn't want anyone to feel obligated or pressured to share their stories. The second reason has to do with the nature of sharing stories and the nature of sharing difficult stories in particular. See, researchers have analyzed this process of meaning making through sharing stories, specifically through reflective writing. So when you take a cohort of people and you ask them to write about something tough or traumatic for multiple days in a row, you find that the first day that they do this, their stories are extremely disorganized. They get from point A to point B eventually, but it's convoluted and they're often using simple and more negative language. After several days of doing this, however, their stories become more organized, more logical, and more cohesive. They also start using more complex, nuanced, and positive language to describe what happened to them and their role in the events. Now, some studies have looked at this process over a time period of days, like what's depicted here, and others have looked at it over months or years. But the takeaway from a storytelling perspective is that this process of meaning making is important regardless of how long it takes. And when you're approaching someone about sharing a potentially traumatic or vulnerable story publicly, you need to be cognizant of the fact that different people are at different places in this journey. If a person hasn't made meaning of their story or isn't emotionally ready to do so, then the process of crafting, editing, and sharing that story can be triggering and damaging for them. That's not what I wanted for anyone, but particularly for the trainees who had already been through so much. On the flip side, if they know the meaning or are emotionally ready to tackle the meaning of their story, then it can be a powerful experience for both storyteller and listener. And we knew this from surveys after prior story slams that people generally feel a sense of catharsis and community after sharing and hearing stories. So it was with this framework that dictated which residents I approached. I was uncertain at first, but that uncertainty quickly turned into surprise at how eager residents were to be a part of this. They were nervous about being on TV, but also kind of pumped to share their stories. And to be clear, not all of the residents who appear in the finished film came to us via the mistreatment reporting structure, but some of them definitely had. And the themes that were evident in so many of those reports were also integral to the way we chose to craft the show and where we chose to place the focus. So filming took place in 2021. I also wrote and told a story in this show because we had medical students, residents, faculty, all the above. This is me in the Regents Hospital Sim Center and my partner here in the bed who graciously agreed to be my fake patient for filming. She's a hardcore introvert, so I owed her a very fancy dinner for her time after this one. And the finished product was released in April 2022. And now I want to take a moment to share a segment from that show. This is a story from Dr. Parisha Rohn. She was a resident at the time of this filming and is now a med-peds hospitalist at the University of Minnesota.
I have come to understand that in the fight for health equity, my presence as a Black woman physician is welcome so long as I am seen and not heard. This conditional acceptance has been a painful realization, and dissent is not without its consequences. A lesson I learned one night while working on the adult inpatient medicine ward. I received a call from the nurse of Patricia, a Black sickle cell patient. I learned that a pill found while cleaning out her handbag had been identified as a narcotic medication. Security and nursing staff requested our presence for a room search. Patricia's mental status had not changed. There had been no change in her vital signs or clinical status, and there was no indication that she had consumed any pills preceding security's presence. Upon relaying this to the nurse and asking for time to review the policy, she paused briefly before asking me to confirm that I would not be participating in the room search. I sat for a while in stunned silence. If a room search was indicated for Patricia, why had it not been indicated earlier in the week for my other patient, who happened to be a white male, when he left the unit, returned somnolent, and returned to normal when he got Narcan, the antidote for opioid pain medication overdoses? By the time I had learned there was no defined room search policy, it had concluded. When I visited Patricia later, she wept while recounting the indignity of being separated from her belongings and being patted down by uniformed staff. Nothing had come of the room search, but she was left to pick up the pieces of her mistreatment. My internal response was a visceral thing, a living, breathing amalgamation of ancestral voices coalescing into a single reverberating word. No, this was wrong. But even rooted in the assurance of advocacy and social justice, an insidious, intoxicating fear pressed forward, determined to lull me into the safety of silence. Speaking up would be a radical act of defiance for a Black woman who has been conditioned to keep her head down, to be agreeable, to not make trouble. When Patricia's nurse asked to debrief, I steeled myself in a stance of curiosity and asked many questions. What was the concern from a nursing perspective? How could we have improved our communication? How do we make decisions on when to implement a room search? What alternatives did we have? When invited, I shared my own perspective. Together, we created a plan to address similar concerns in the future. We shook hands and hugged. The chasm between us didn't feel so wide. While it wouldn't change what happened with Patricia, we could prevent harm to another patient, and that was something. The next night, I was informed that nursing staff had filed a complaint stating I had been unsupportive and refused to act collaboratively. First came shock, then anger. And when the anger was spent, an overwhelming emotional exhaustion. I cried for days afterward. It had taken me years of training and education to learn to abandon the lessons handed down by my forefathers, to keep my head down, to be agreeable, to not make trouble. I wonder if they understood that through the weaponization of their feedback, they had taken something from me that I couldn't get back. What had they given up? I was ready to have difficult conversations to bridge the divide. But even though I had arrived, had been welcomed even, I am still subject to the same inequities that my patients face. I think of Patricia often. I worry that the damage done to her is irreparable. I worry that progress is too slow and patients are being harmed while we strive for what could be. I worry that while I believe being the dissenting voice was right, I may not always have the fortitude to always be a voice for the voiceless.
And so I hope that you can see and feel how stories like this might hit differently than simply showing data, even if we end up combining things like this with statistics to drive home a particular point. We had medical students, residents, attendings, and administrators all take time out of their busy schedules to appear in this show, and the results went far beyond what we were hoping for. This show also got a national distribution. It aired in over 30 states and won a regional Emmy, which, needless to say, was really, really amazing. But the other really cool thing that happened over the next several years was watching the impact of this show, not only on our medical students here, because we use segments from this show to teach parts of their Becoming a Doctor course, but also having educators from other parts of the country reach out and ask if they can use parts of this show in their own anti-bias and anti-racism curriculums. So after all of this, where are we at today? Well, from a residency standpoint, our mistreatment and bias subcommittee is still running strong. We're collecting data and stories and using that information to identify systemic patterns. We're also committed to improving the clinical learning environment for our trainees. Right now, that usually means intervention at either the individual level or the departmental level, but we hope to eventually be able to reach the organizational level and improve the overall climate and culture. Some of our near-term goals include focusing further on the dynamic between faculty and residents and using our growing collection of stories as the backbone for a faculty development series that would be a skills-based medical educator curriculum. CFAM is also still going strong. We released a show on healthy aging in 2022. We partnered with The Nocturnist in April 2023 to host a live storytelling show right here in Minneapolis. And if any of you listen to the Nocturnist podcast, which you all should, hashtag shameless plug, the stories from this event are all in season 6. And then we created the 4th show in the Art and Medicine series, which is centered around the topic of disability. So, in addition to talking about the science behind storytelling and the power of stories in general, I hope that you've also learned a bit about CFAM, a bit about our residency's mistreatment and bias work, and then a little bit about my own personal journey of leveraging various facets of storytelling into the arena of advocacy. This is by no means the only way to use storytelling as a tool for advocacy, because there's a lot out there and a lot of awesome people doing amazing work. This is simply the way that drew me in, and also is a function of my interest, my passion, but also right time, right place, right people. So I really, really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk with you guys about something that I really care about. And I appreciate your time and you guys listening. Thank you.
Wow, Dr. Williams, thank you so much, not only for this outstanding presentation today, but for your body of work. Thank you so much for sharing. I'll create some time and space for anybody to offer comments or questions in our Q&A, so please feel free to go ahead and speak up. I'll open us up with a couple of thoughts and questions. I think you spoke early in your talk about story as a moral technology and a tool. Many of us as physicians are more comfortable in the space of data and evidence and feel, I think, both more comfortable and using that as a tool as we speak, not only with individual patients, but perhaps the broader community in terms of trying to influence or sway ideas. And I wondered if you had any practical suggestions or things that you use or have seen used for integrating story as we interact with patients and colleagues.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and that's like a ongoing reflective practice, for me. What I would say is that, I make a delineation between communicating with other medical professionals where we understand data and statistics studies as a shared language, and then communicating with someone who may not have the same training, whether that's patients or other professionals in different fields, and understanding that, to me, data guides like kind of my destination, where I'm trying to get. But to get, particularly, let's say, a patient there, I need to kind of package those recommendations in the form of story, right? That's where things like, hey, motivational interviewing come in to figure out what do you care about and how can I map what I know needs to happen from a data lens, from a best practices lens, to something that is relevant to you, and then merge those into essentially a story. And I think a lot of us do this with patients, whether we're aware of it or not, where we have a lot of the subjective, empathetic aspects of our personality that come out in patient encounters. And we are aware of this wealth of data kind of sitting in the back, but then also knowing that we have to know the person in front of us, tailor what we're giving to that person. And if we do that well, there's a markedly increased chance that what you want for them will get in a way that's better than just showing them the statistics on what's best for them. And so as a general philosophy, that's what I would say. As if you have specific examples, because mine's all hospitalist based, I think of story really governs kind of my outer interaction with patients in particular, of getting to know them, having them getting to know a little bit about me, and then everything else that I'm filtering through for them is filtered through this lens of story and how it impacts them directly as people. So that's a good question. I love that.
Great, thank you. Super helpful. Another question of curiosity, especially as yourself a writer and creative writer and teller of stories, we are sometimes faced with the opportunity to share patient stories, both well, in a variety of settings, from informal to more formal, including narrative publications and the like. And while I think we have a standard with regard to protection of patient confidentiality, I just wondered your general take, observations, or cautions that you have had with regard to sharing what truly is somebody else's story.
Yeah, no, I love that too, and that's something that I think we have a responsibility to put a lot of intentionality behind thinking about what parts of an interaction are my story to share and what part is someone else's story to share. Okay, and so sometimes we can get around this a little bit by asking patients or other folks for permission to share that story. That's great, but I also think in terms of when you think about the dynamic of a story that I may want to tell, how to keep the perspective and lens into things that belong to me or my perspective in that story, right? And that's not I don't think there's really any objective approach to that. That is a subjective thing. And for me, that's what I find helpful to have other people who are passionate about writing and storytelling as editors, mirrors, to be like, oh, like this story is great, but like this part here, you're kind of treading into territory that isn't your story to tell, right? So let's think about either taking it out or adjusting the lens, right? And so I do think that is a huge responsibility for us. We have stories. We have a lot of things that are emotionally impactful that I think it benefits us as the community to share with each other. But we also, that doesn't give us kind of a permission to ignore the boundaries of what's ours to share versus what may belong to the patient or family or whoever. So I 100% vibe with that as a concept. And if anyone has any more objective approaches for how to make that delineation, I am definitely open to hearing about that. So
I think we're all trying and learning, so thanks for your experience and your perspective. Early in your talk, you also gave examples of engaging with story and with fiction and being a way towards building empathy. I think some of us as people and some of us as physicians, and maybe particularly as trainees with many other competing priorities, gravitate more naturally towards engagement of work and narrative competence, reading and writing and the like. Should we be trying to reach our trainees broadly to engage them in this work, or do people really need to come to this when they are ready, if that question makes sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And I think a good example of that is kind of looking at the impact, or like when we thread some of these ideas of reflective writing, some narrative medicine practices into kind of the medical school curriculum, right? So we do this and we have a relatively small sliver of the medical school curriculum. I think there is an argument to be made for some baseline level of this, but mostly like as an introduction, because I do think that there needs to be, to go further and deeper, there needs to be an interest or a passion. And even though this is my interest and passion, I'm not here saying, oh, this should be for everyone, right? I do think it has benefits to be included at a baseline level broadly for our trainees, medical school, and even for residencies, if we have that time in that space. But then the argument becomes the level at which this is included, right? And so kind of how we do is we have, it's definitely included into the medical school. And then we basically, because we have all these sites and we have a lot of buy-in in terms of like storytelling and a culture of storytelling, we just make it really broadly evident that like, hey, you're welcome to join. And we have several levels, right? Like, so if you're chill, nervous, you know, don't want to do too much, right? We have like monthly kind of groups where we meet and we read the A Piece of My Minds from JAMA and other types of publications. We talk about it, and then there's just some free writing time, and it's just really chill, right? You have story slams, which are a little bit more like you're going to craft a story, you're going to tell a story, and then you have other stuff still, which are things like the Nocturnist or things that like you're on stage for, right? So creating that culture where people can get in where they fit in at each level, I think is great to augment the kind of minimum baseline level of storytelling, narrative, those kind of things. So.
Great, thanks. Those specifics are so helpful. Well, Dr. Williams, I'm recognizing we are right at the top of the hour. Thank you so much for elevating this work and elevating diverse voices. So happy to have you join us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.